Hi everyone, and welcome back to Echo Barrow, a place where history comes alive and complex stories are made clear. Today, we'll uncover the sweeping story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, spanning from ancient kingdoms of the Iron Age to the struggles that shape our world today. This conflict between Israelis and Palestinians has lasted for generations, making headlines around the world. But why? Why has it proven so hard to solve? Why does it inspire such deep emotions, not only locally, but globally? To really understand it, we have to travel back in time, not just decades, but thousands of years. This is a story about ancient faiths and empires, colonial promises, wars, refugees, and two people each claiming the same land as home. Let's trace this conflict from ancient kingdoms and conquests to modern wars and failed peace deals to understand why it remains one of the world's most stubborn and painful disputes. Our story begins thousands of years ago, in the land historically known as Canaan, a region in the eastern Mediterranean, roughly covering parts of modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. This land has been revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In ancient times, it saw the rise of the Israelite kingdoms. During the Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 586 BCE, two related Hebrew kingdoms, Israel and Judah, ruled much of the region. It was the biblical kingdom of Israel where, according to scripture, kings David and Solomon reigned, and the first temple stood in Jerusalem. These early Jewish kingdoms coexisted and clashed with other people. Along the southern coast lived the Philistines, a seafaring people believed to have originated from the Aegean region, who settled in fortified coastal cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They were known for their military strength and frequent conflicts with the Israelites, famously remembered in stories like David and Goliath. Beyond them were neighboring realms and tribal kingdoms in what are today Jordan and Syria, making the land a dynamic crossroads of alliances, trade, and warfare. This ancient Jewish presence would later be central to the claims and spiritual connection of Jews to the land. In 586 BCE, however, the Babylonian Empire centered in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, conquered Judah, destroyed Solomon's temple, and exiled many Jews. They returned and rebuilt the temple under Persian rule, only to see it destroyed again centuries later by the Romans. Persia, by the way, being what we now call Iran. History does have its twists. By the 1st century BCE, the region was under Rome's occupation. Judea, as the Romans called the area, bristled under foreign rule, and Jewish revolts erupted. The most fateful uprising came in 132 to 135 CE, when Simon Bar Kokhba led a fierce rebellion against Rome, a leader who inspired hope as a messiah for many Jews. Roman legions brutally crushed it, reportedly killing hundreds of thousands of Jews. In the aftermath, Emperor Hadrian, the Roman ruler at that time, renamed Judea as Syria Palestina, the first use of Palestine to designate the province, and, according to some accounts, banned Jews from Jerusalem. This marked the start of a vast Jewish diaspora, as Rome's brutal suppression of the revolt and destruction of Judea forced many Jews to scatter widely beyond their historic homeland, establishing communities throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East, even as some Jewish populations remained in Galilee, a region in northern Israel, and in other areas. Meanwhile, Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, and Christianity spread across the Roman Near East, the eastern provinces like Judea, Syria, and Lebanon. By the 4th century, the Roman Byzantine Empire had embraced Christianity, turning Jerusalem into a major center of Christian pilgrimage. Churches rose over holy sites, and the city became sacred to Christians, as it already was to Jews. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell, each leaving its mark on the Holy Land's tapestry. In the 7th century, a new power from Arabia swept in. In 637 CE, the forces of the nascent Islamic Caliphate besieged and captured Jerusalem. The city's Byzantine Christian patriarch surrendered to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, who, as tradition holds, entered Jerusalem humbly. Umar permitted Jews, who had been barred under Byzantine rule, to return to Jerusalem and even pray at their ancient holy sites. Under Muslim rule, the land, now often called Palestine, became predominantly Arab and Islamic, but it remained a mosaic of faiths. The Dome of the Rock was built around 691 CE in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, enshrining the rock revered in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition. This era of early Islamic caliphates, Umayyad, then Abbasid, generally saw a relative coexistence among Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all considered people of the book in Islamic law. But the land's sanctity would draw others with competing visions. In 1099, amid the fervor of the Crusades, European Christian knights stormed Jerusalem. The First Crusade seized the Holy City, and chroniclers recount that the Crusaders massacred many of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The conquerors established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other Crusader states. For nearly a century, Latin Christian kings ruled in Jerusalem, turning the Dome of the Rock into a church and restricting other faiths. Yet their foothold was tenuous. Saladin, the famed Muslim general of Kurdish origin and sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty, united Muslim forces. In 1187, he defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin and liberated Jerusalem, ending 88 years of Crusader rule. Saladin famously allowed Christian inhabitants to leave or stay safely, and even some Jews to return. Over the 13th century, the Crusaders mounted more campaigns, but ultimately Muslim dynasties, first the Ayyubids, then the Mamluks, expelled them completely by 1291. For the next few centuries, the land of Palestine became a quiet corner of great empires. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled it until 1517, when the Ottoman Empire conquered the region. Under Ottoman rule, 1517 to 1917, Palestine was not a separate country, but a part of the provinces of Ottoman Syria. Still, cities like Jerusalem, Nablus, Gaza, Jaffa, and Hebron thrived as market towns and holy sites. The population was mostly Arabic-speaking Muslim, with Christian and Jewish minorities living in relative peace under the Ottoman millet system, which allowed religious communities to govern their own affairs. For centuries, Ottoman Palestine saw periods of stability and diversity, albeit amid imperial neglect. Travelers in the 19th century found ancient villages among terraced hills and the old city walls of Jerusalem sheltering communities of many faiths. Little did the inhabitants know that enormous changes loomed as empires and ideas from abroad would soon upend this age-old order. By the late 19th century, new ideologies swept over the people of the Middle East and Europe alike. Nationalism, the desire for self-determination of people, began stirring within the Ottoman Empire's many ethnic groups, including the Arabs. At the same time, in Europe, Jews faced rising anti-Semitism, pogroms, and exclusion. This galvanized a movement called Zionism, Jewish nationalism, which sought to establish a safe homeland for the Jewish people, ideally in their ancestral land of Palestine. In 1897, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian Jew, convened the First Zionist Congress, proclaiming the goal of creating a Jewish national home in Palestine. For Zionists, the biblical connection to the land and the urgent need to escape persecution converged. Starting in the 1880s, waves of Jewish immigrants, many escaping Russian pogroms or later the turmoil of World War I, arrived in Ottoman Palestine. They bought land, sometimes from absentee landlords, and founded agricultural settlements. Though still a small minority, by 1914 Jews were about 6% of the population. These pioneers planted the seeds of a future Jewish state. Meanwhile, educated Arab Ottomans, including those in Syria and Palestine, began articulating Arab nationalist ideas. They imagined independence from Turkish Ottoman rule and the unity of Arab-speaking peoples. By the early 20th century, Arab locals in Palestine were becoming aware that Zionist immigration could threaten their majority and their connection to the land. Tensions simmered between the tiny but growing Jewish settler community, the Yishuv, and the Arab population, though under Ottoman rule overt conflict was limited. It would take the crucible of World War I to truly ignite these competing national aspirations. In 1914, World War I erupted, and the Middle East was a major prize. The declining Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and the Central Powers. Britain and France plotted to carve up Ottoman lands in the event of victory, and they made promises, some secret, some public, that would later haunt Palestine. In 1915-16, British High Commissioner Henry McMahon corresponded with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, hinting that if the Arabs revolted against the Ottomans, Britain would support an independent Arab kingdom in the region. Believing these assurances, Arab forces, led by Hussein's son Faisal, joined the British war effort. Yet at the same time, May 1916, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, envisioning dividing the Middle East between their colonial spheres, with Palestine slated for international administration given its sacred status. Then, in November 1917, as British troops fought up through Sinai toward Palestine, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the famous Balfour Declaration. In a letter to Lord Rothschild, Balfour stated that Britain supported the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while adding that nothing should prejudice the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. With this, Great Britain publicly embraced Zionism, a gesture welcomed by many Jews and viewed with alarm by Arabs. In December 1917, British General Edmund Allenby entered Jerusalem, having defeated the Ottomans. By 1918, World War I ended with Ottoman defeat, and Britain took control of Palestine. Competing promises now collided. The local Arab populace, over 90% of Palestine's inhabitants at the time, expected independence or inclusion in an Arab state, as implied by McMahon's letters. Zionist Jews, on the other hand, expected Britain to facilitate their national home, as promised by Balfour. In 1920, the victors of World War I met at San Remo and formally granted Britain a mandate over Palestine and France a mandate over Syria-Lebanon. The League of Nations mandate for Palestine, finalized in 1922, enshrined the Balfour Declaration. Britain was tasked with helping establish a Jewish national home in Palestine while also safeguarding the civil and religious rights of the Arab majority. From the start, the British mandate was a powder keg. Palestinian Arabs felt betrayed. Their aspirations for self-rule deferred. In 1920, 1921, and 1929, tensions exploded into communal violence. Protests and riots broke out, often sparked by disputes over holy places or new Jewish immigration. One flashpoint was the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall, in Jerusalem, sacred to Jews and located next to important Islamic holy sites. By the late 1920s, riots led to scores of deaths on both sides. British commissions of inquiry struggled to recommend solutions, often suggesting limits to Jewish immigration, only for Zionists to object. Meanwhile, Jewish immigration surged, especially as European anti-Semitism worsened. During the 1920-30, tens of thousands of Jews arrived from Eastern Europe and Germany. The Jewish population rose from about 1/10 of the country in 1918 to nearly 30% by the mid-1930s. Many new immigrants were desperate refugees from Nazism. They joined existing Jewish communities, built new towns like Tel Aviv, and formed defense forces, the Haganah. The Arabs of Palestine, largely peasants and townsfolk, saw land being sold out from under them, often by absentee landlords, and feared becoming a minority in their own homeland. By the mid-1930s, Palestinian Arabs reached a boiling point. In 1936, Arab frustration at continued Jewish immigration and British rule erupted into a full-scale uprising known as the Arab Revolt of 1936-39, the first major, sustained Palestinian nationalist revolt. It began in April 1936 with spontaneous violence, after 2 Jews were killed in an attack on a convoy, and, in retaliation, Jewish paramilitaries killed 2 Arab peasants near Anabda. Anger swept the country. Local militant followers of a preacher, Sheikh Is al-Din al-Qassam, killed by the British the year before, took to the hills. Palestinian political parties united to form an Arab Higher Committee under Jerusalem's Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. They declared a general strike that lasted months, demanding a halt to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales to Jews, and independence. The strike and peasant-led guerrilla attacks paralyzed the country. British authority began to buckle as rural areas slipped from their control. The British response was swift and harsh. Alarmed by the scale of the revolt, which mobilized thousands of Arabs from all classes in nationalist fervor, Britain dispatched over 20,000 troops to Palestine. The Zionist Yishuv, for its part, mobilized its own defenses. By 1939, the Jewish Haganah militia had over 15,000 trained fighters. The revolt waxed and waned over 3 bloody years. Villages were bombed and rebels hunted down by British soldiers. A young officer named Ord Wingate was among those leading counterinsurgency operations. The British also armed Jewish auxiliary forces to help suppress the Arab rebels. By 1939, the rebellion was crushed at a terrible cost. Over 5,000 Palestinians were killed, their leadership decimated, many arrested, exiled, or on the run, and the Arab economy shattered. The British execution of rebels and collective punishments left deep scars. During the revolt, Britain tried a political solution. In 1937, a royal commission headed by Lord Peel investigated the unrest. The Peel Commission report concluded that the conflict arose from irreconcilable Arab and Jewish national aspirations. Right against right, as it famously described. It deemed the mandate unworkable and, boldly, recommended partition of Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab, with British control over a corridor including Jerusalem. For the first time, a British body spoke of creating a Jewish state on about 20% of Palestine. Zionist leaders were ambivalent but accepted partition in principle, seeing it as a stepping stone to statehood. Palestinian Arabs, however, were horrified. They rejected partition outright, especially the suggestion of forced transfer of Arabs out of the proposed Jewish area. When the British government floated a smaller-scale partition in 1938, the Woodhead Commission, it too failed to gain support. Ultimately, with World War II looming, Britain changed tack. It issued a white paper in 1939 limiting Jewish immigration drastically to 75,000 over 5 years and promising eventual independence for a unified Palestine within 10 years, effectively renouncing the idea of a Jewish state. This white paper was seen as a betrayal by Zionists, but it temporarily appeased Arab demands, helping to end the revolt. By 1939, Palestine was scarred and subdued, just as a greater calamity was about to engulf the world. Then came World War II, 1939 to 45, bringing cataclysm to Europe and new trauma to the Holy Land. The Jewish people suffered the Holocaust, Nazi Germany's genocide that murdered 6 million Jews. European Jewry was devastated, and hundreds of thousands of survivors were left displaced with nowhere to go. Palestine, in their eyes, was their haven, but the British White Paper barred their entry. During the war, Britain, needing Arab support, kept Palestine's doors nearly shut to Jewish refugees. Desperate Holocaust survivors languished in European camps or attempted to reach Palestine clandestinely on overcrowded ships like the Exodus 1947, only to be turned back by the Royal Navy. This humanitarian tragedy galvanized world sympathy for the Zionist cause. Within Palestine, the war years were tense but relatively quiet. Many Palestinian Arabs, though hostile to Zionism, opposed the fascist axis as well. Many Jews in Palestine joined the British Army, some 27,000 enlisted to fight Hitler. A smaller number of extremist Zionists, however, saw Britain as the main enemy and waged an anti-British campaign. Groups like the Irgun, led by Menachem Begin, and the Lehi, Stern Gang, resorted to terror attacks against British officials and infrastructure. They sought to force Britain to allow Jewish immigration and leave Palestine. In 1944, Lehi even assassinated Britain's minister in the Middle East, Lord Moyne. By 1945, as the world learned the full horror of the Holocaust, pressure mounted on Britain to admit Jewish refugees. U.S. President Harry Truman urged Britain to let in 100,000 Jewish displaced persons. But British authorities, facing angry Arab opposition and stretched by post-war austerity, refused to lift the ban. Britain's colonial grip was weakening. The Holy Land was becoming ungovernable. Jewish insurgents bombed the British administrative headquarters at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in July 1946, killing 91 people. Palestinian Arabs, for their part, were leaderless. The Mufti Haj Amin had fled to exile and still reeling from the revolt's suppression, but they seethed as Jewish immigration, often illegal, continued. The British Army now had 100,000 troops in Palestine trying to keep order, a costly deployment for a bankrupt empire. By early 1947, Britain had had enough. London announced it would terminate the mandate and hand over the problem of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations. The stage was set for an international solution, or so it seemed. In 1947, the world community attempted to solve what had become an intractable conflict. The United Nations formed a special committee, UNSCOP, to recommend Palestine's future. After surveying conditions on the ground, including touring refugee camps of Holocaust survivors and hearing Arab and Jewish testimonies, UNSCOP delivered its plan. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly approved Resolution 181, the Partition Plan. It recommended ending the British Mandate and dividing Palestine into two independent states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international administration due to its unique religious importance. The proposed map granted about 56% of Palestine to a Jewish state and about 43% to an Arab state, with Jerusalem and Bethlehem as an international enclave. This allocation was contentious. Jews, who by then were one-third of the population, were to get slightly over half the land, including the fertile coastal plain and much of the Negev Desert. Arabs, over two-thirds of the population, would receive the remainder, including the Central Highlands and a coastal strip around Gaza. The Jewish state as drawn would have an almost 45% Arab minority within it, while the Arab state would be entirely Arab. Zionist leaders accepted the UN plan. Despite misgivings, they had hoped for Jerusalem and more territory. For them, partition was a momentous victory, international legitimacy for a Jewish state. As news of the UN vote spread on that November day in Tel Aviv, Jews danced in the streets. But the Palestinian Arabs and surrounding Arab states flatly rejected the plan. They felt it was grossly unfair. Why should a third of the people get more than half the land, especially when much of the land allotted to the Jewish state was owned or inhabited by Arabs? Arab delegates warned that partition violated the UN Charter's principle of self-determination, since Palestine's Arab majority opposed it. When the UN announcement came, Arab Palestine erupted in a general strike and furious protests. Violence between the communities broke out almost immediately, essentially the start of a civil war. Britain, exhausted and intent on leaving, announced it would end the mandate on May 14, 1948, and withdraw its forces. But as British troops pulled out, Jews and Arabs in Palestine plunged into conflict. From December 1947 onward, the two communities fought for control of roads, cities, and strategic points. The better organized Jewish Haganah moved to secure the areas earmarked for the Jewish state and in some cases beyond. Arab volunteers from neighboring countries joined local Palestinian fighters, but there was little central coordination. By spring 1948, the war escalated. In April, the Irgun's attack on the Arab village of Deir Yassin, killing over 100 villagers, spread panic among Palestinians. At the same time, Arab militiamen ambushed a Jewish medical convoy to Hadassah Hospital, killing 78. Fear and exodus began. Palestinians from mixed cities like Haifa and Jaffa fled as battles raged. By May 1948, an estimated 250,000 Palestinian Arabs had already fled or been expelled from their homes amid the violence. On May 14, 1948, a fateful line was crossed. That afternoon, in Tel Aviv, Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel effective at midnight, as the British mandate expired. The new state's birth was rooted in the UN partition plan's borders, though Ben-Gurion did not specify boundaries in the declaration. U.S. President Harry Truman granted recognition within minutes. Jubilant Jews celebrated their long-awaited nationhood. But for the Arab Palestinians, this moment marked the beginning of what they call al-Nakba, the catastrophe. The very next day, May 15, 1948, armies of 5 Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, moved in to intervene on behalf of the Palestinian Arabs. The first Arab-Israeli war erupted in full force. The 1948 war was a war of survival and identity for both sides. Israelis, many of them recent Holocaust survivors, felt they were fighting a second war of liberation, a war of independence, against armies bent on their destruction. Arab governments framed their intervention as rescuing Palestine and restoring law and order after Britain's withdrawal. But in truth, the Arab forces were not unified in strategy and were often outmatched by the mobilized Israeli militias, now the Israel Defense Forces (IDF). Heavy fighting raged over the next months in waves. First, the Israelis halted the Arab advance, then a UN-mediated truce, then renewed fighting. Jerusalem was a major battleground, Jewish West Jerusalem held by the Haganah and Arab East Jerusalem, including the Old City, besieged by the Arab Legion of Transjordan. In the north, Israeli forces clashed with Syrians around the Galilee. In the south, they battled Egyptians in the Negev and around the besieged Palestinian coastal strip of Gaza. Through mid-1948, the tide turned decisively in Israel's favor. The reasons were manifold. The Israelis had superior organization, internal lines of communication, and eventually arms, notably after acquiring Czech weapons, while the Arab armies were disunited and logistically stretched. One by one, Arab offensives stalled. Transjordan's Arab Legion, the best Arab force, took East Jerusalem and the West Bank highlands, but avoided invading territory allotted to the Jewish state, a reflection of Jordan's own designs on the Arab part of Palestine. By the fall of 1948, the IDF went on the offensive, expanding beyond the UN partition lines. It captured the Galilee, pushed the Egyptian army out of the Negev up to the Gaza Strip, and even briefly crossed into Egyptian Sinai. Arab villages and urban neighborhoods emptied in fear or were conquered. In some cases, Israeli forces ordered expulsions. Dozens of massacres or atrocities, like Deir Yassin earlier and later at Lydda and Al-Dawayma, terrorized civilians. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, an estimated 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinians, roughly half the Arab population of pre-war Palestine, had fled or were expelled from their homes. They poured into refugee camps in neighboring Arab lands. The Gaza Strip, held by Egypt, the West Bank, held by Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. Hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages, over 500, were depopulated during the war. Many were razed or repopulated with Jewish immigrants, and maps were redrawn with Hebrew place names. The war formally ended by early 1949 with separate armistice deals. The new armistice lines, known as the Green Line, now defined the rough borders of Israel. Israel survived and significantly expanded its territory, controlling about 78% of the former British Mandate versus 55% allotted by the UN plan. It held all of Coastal Plain, Galilee, and Negev, as well as West Jerusalem. Transjordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem. In 1950, it renamed itself Jordan. Egypt kept control of the Gaza Strip. No Arab-Palestinian state emerged. The areas where it was meant to arise were now split between Jordanian and Egyptian control. The Palestinians themselves, stateless and shattered, began their long exile. Those who stayed in the new Israel, about 150,000 Arabs, became Israeli citizens, but under military rule for years. The majority, however, were refugees, their homes and lands taken by Israel, which barred their return. This is the Nakba, the defining Palestinian tragedy. For Jews, 1948 was a triumphant independence. For Palestinians, it was the catastrophic loss of their homeland. These dual narratives of 1948, independence versus Nakba, would shape both people's identities and the contours of the conflict for generations. The guns fell silent in 1949, but a lasting peace remained elusive. The newly established state of Israel was not recognized by its Arab neighbors, except gradually by Jordan regarding its new borders. The 1949 armistice lines were not formal borders, just ceasefire demarcations, a fact that left key issues unresolved. Jerusalem was divided. Israel held the western parts of the city, while Jordan held the old city and eastern neighborhoods. Barbed wire and walls ran through the heart of Jerusalem. Holy sites like the Western Wall fell under Jordanian control. Israeli Jews were barred from their sacred sites, and Jewish cemeteries on the Mount of Olives were desecrated. Conversely, Palestinians who had fled West Jerusalem or other areas now in Israel were not allowed back to their homes, which were occupied by new Israeli immigrants. From 1949 to 1967, no Palestinian state arose. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, was annexed by Jordan. Its Palestinian residents granted Jordanian citizenship, but effectively under Hashemite rule. The Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt, which, however, did not annex it or grant Gazans Egyptian citizenship. Instead, Gaza's large refugee population lived under Egyptian military governance, yearning to return home one day. In these years, the Palestinian national cause was largely championed, or some would say hijacked, by the surrounding Arab states. The conflict simmered in other forms. Along the armistice lines, Fedayeen guerrillas from the refugee camps occasionally infiltrated into Israel to harass or reclaim property, and Israel often responded with reprisal raids. These tit-for-tat incursions kept tensions high and occasionally flared into larger clashes. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was one flashpoint. Israel, allied with Britain and France, invaded Egypt's Sinai after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Israeli forces swiftly captured Gaza and Sinai, showcasing Israel's growing military might. Under intense U.S. and Soviet pressure, however, Israel withdrew in 1957. Notably, the 1956 war brought the plight of the Palestinians into sharper focus. In the Gaza Strip, still packed with refugees, an Israeli unit committed the Kafr Qasim massacre on the eve of the war, killing 48 Arab civilians inside Israel, an event that underscored the precarious position of Arabs under Israeli rule. It was also in this period that the Palestinians began to organize independently. In 1964, with backing from Egypt's Nasser, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was founded. The PLO's initial leaders were Arab government appointees, and its charter called for the liberation of Palestine and destruction of Israel. At first, it had little autonomy, but this organization would soon take center stage as the voice of Palestinian national aspirations. History, however, was about to accelerate and dramatically reshape the conflict's parameters in 1967. By the mid-1960s, the Middle East was a tinderbox of nationalist fervor, ideological rivalry, and great power intrigue. In June 1967, it exploded. The events of that year, known as the Six-Day War, would radically alter the map and fate of Israel-Palestine. Mounting tensions set the stage. Syria and Israeli forces skirmished over the Golan Heights. Palestinian guerrilla attacks from Syrian and Jordanian territory were on the rise, now often led by Fatah, Yasser Arafat's faction within the PLO, and Egypt's President Nasser, champion of Pan-Arabism, ramped up bellicose rhetoric. In May 1967, Nasser took a fateful step. He expelled UN peacekeepers from Sinai and blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's Red Sea access. Israel viewed this as a casus belli. Amid regional mobilization and threats to drive Israel into the sea, Israel's government decided to strike first. On June 5, 1967, the Israeli Air Force launched a sudden preemptive attack, decimating the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan on the ground. With air superiority assured, Israeli troops swept to stunning victories on 3 fronts in just 6 days. On the Sinai front, Israeli armor punched through Egyptian lines and raced to the Suez Canal. On the Eastern Front, despite an earlier Israeli plea for Jordan to stay out, Jordanian forces shelled West Jerusalem. So Israel counterattacked, seizing East Jerusalem and then, in fierce fighting, the entire West Bank up to the Jordan River. Israeli paratroopers entered the Old City of Jerusalem on June 7, standing before the Western Wall for the first time in 19 years, an emotional high point for Israelis. In the north, Israeli troops repelled Syrian artillery from the Golan Heights and then captured that strategic plateau. By June 10, the war was over, and the map had dramatically changed. Israel now occupied the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank from Jordan, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Israel's victory was swift and total. In 6 days, Israel more than tripled the territory under its control. Jubilation swept Israel. But for Arabs, and especially Palestinians, 1967 was another disaster, called Al-Naqsa, the setback. About 300,000 more Palestinians fled or were displaced in the fighting, many second-time refugees. having first fled in 1948. The entire Palestinian population of Gaza and the West Bank, roughly 1 million people, now fell under Israeli military occupation. Jerusalem, revered by all three faiths, was now entirely under Israeli control. Israel promptly annexed East Jerusalem, extending its law and administration there, a move not recognized internationally. The world watched as jubilant Israelis prayed freely at the Western Wall, even as Palestinian families mourned newly lost homes in the Old City's Muslim quarter or new exiles streamed across the Jordan River. In November 1967, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, calling for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the war in exchange for peace and recognition, the famous Land for Peace formula. This resolution, ambiguous in its wording, would become the reference point for all future peace efforts. Israel indicated willingness to trade Sinai back to Egypt and Golan to Syria for peace, but notably not the newly acquired Palestinian territories. The Arab states, for their part, met in Khartoum and declared the three no's: no peace, no recognition, no negotiations with Israel. The Palestinians themselves were not directly consulted. Their fate was, once again, being discussed by others. Meanwhile, on the ground, Israeli settlement building in the newly occupied lands began within months of the war, a process that continues to this day. The first Jewish settlement in the West Bank, Kfar Etzion, was re-established as early as September 1967. Israel treated East Jerusalem as part of its sovereign territory, uniting the city and greatly expanding its municipal borders. Palestinians in East Jerusalem were given a special status, permanent residents of Israel, though not full citizens unless they applied, while Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza became subject to Israeli military administration. Thus, from 1967 onward, the core of the Israel-Palestine conflict became the struggle over these occupied territories and the rights of the Palestinian people living under occupation. The years after 1967 brought no resolution, only a dangerous stalemate. Israel was triumphant but isolated, facing sporadic resistance. The occupied Palestinians chafed under military rule, and the PLO, now based in Jordan and then Lebanon, launched guerrilla raids and dramatic international attacks, like airline hijackings, to press their cause. Arab countries were still angry and hurt about losing badly in the 1967 war. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria sprang a coordinated surprise attack on Israel, igniting the Yom Kippur War, also called the October War or Ramadan War. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, and in the midst of Ramadan, when Egyptian troops surged across the Suez Canal into Sinai and Syrian forces struck on the Golan Heights. The attacking Arab armies achieved complete surprise and early victories. Egyptian soldiers overran the Bar-Lev defensive line in Sinai and advanced into the desert, while Syrian tanks pushed onto the Golan, threatening to descend toward the Galilee. For the first few days, Israel's situation was dire, shattering the myth of invincibility left by 1967. But Israel mobilized reserves and, backed by a massive U.S. emergency airlift of arms, even as the USSR resupplied Egypt and Syria, managed to turn the tide. After brutal tank battles, Israeli forces repelled the Syrians and even advanced within artillery range of Damascus. In the Sinai, General Ariel Sharon led a bold maneuver, crossing the Suez Canal to the African side, encircling part of the Egyptian Third Army. After about 3 weeks of intense combat, a UN-brokered ceasefire took hold by late October 1973. Both sides claimed moral victory. Egypt had avenged some of the shame of 1967 by proving Israeli forces were not invulnerable, and Israel ultimately repelled its enemies and even gained a new forward position in Egypt before the ceasefire. But the cost was heavy. The 1973 war was far bloodier than previous ones, with over 2,500 Israelis and perhaps 8,500 Arab soldiers dead. Civilians also suffered, and the war's shock triggered a global oil crisis when Arab states imposed an oil embargo. Most importantly, the 1973 war jolted the political landscape. It led directly to a historic breakthrough. Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, concluded that a military solution was untenable and that only diplomacy could regain Egypt's lost Sinai. The United States, under Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy, helped negotiate disengagement agreements. Finally, in 1977, Sadat dramatically broke the psychological barrier by visiting Jerusalem and speaking before the Israeli Knesset, signaling a willingness to make peace. This paved the way for the Camp David Accords of 1978. Under U.S. President Jimmy Carter's mediation at Camp David, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin struck a framework for peace. The resulting Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty, signed March 1979, saw Israel agree to withdraw fully from the Sinai Peninsula, dismantling all Israeli settlements there, in return for Egypt's full recognition of Israel and a peace agreement. This marked the first Arab country to make peace with Israel, shattering a pan-Arab taboo. Israel returned Sinai to Egypt by 1982, gaining a secure southern border. The Camp David Accords also included a vague outline for resolving the Palestinian issue, calling for a 5-year autonomy plan for the West Bank and Gaza and negotiations over final status. But notably, no Palestinians were direct signatories, and the PLO bitterly opposed the separate peace. In fact, Egypt was ostracized by many Arab states for abandoning the Palestinian cause. While the Egypt-Israel Treaty removed the strongest Arab military threat to Israel and brought a cold but lasting peace, the Palestinian question remained unanswered. Israel continued to control the West Bank and Gaza, and Jewish settlements in those areas kept growing. The PLO, now recognized by Arab states, in 1974 the Arab League declared the PLO the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, intensified its struggle from exile, setting the stage for a shift of the conflict's focal point back to the Palestinian arena. Through the 1960s and 70s, the Palestinian national movement took shape, often in fire and blood. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, though formed in 1964 under Arab League auspices, truly came into its own after the 1967 defeat discredited reliance on Arab regimes. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the militant Fatah faction, became chairman of the PLO in 1969. The PLO adopted guerrilla warfare and terrorism to put the Palestinian cause on the world map. Throughout the 1970s, PLO groups carried out cross-border raids into Israel and high-profile international attacks, hijacking airliners, taking hostages, and tragically, at the 1972 Munich Olympics, a PLO faction, Black September, killed 11 Israeli athletes. The PLO's actions were condemned by Israel and the West as terrorism, but to many Palestinians and other colonized peoples, they symbolized a fight for liberation when all else had failed. The PLO had a tumultuous journey. After 1970, it was expelled from Jordan following a civil war, Black September, with King Hussein's government, and it relocated to Lebanon, where it established a quasi-state in the southern part of the country. From there, PLO fighters launched attacks into northern Israel, which in turn prompted Israeli retaliations and eventually a full-scale Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982 to crush the PLO. The Israeli army reached Beirut and besieged Arafat and his fighters. Under international pressure, the PLO evacuated Lebanon, moving its base to Tunisia, far from Israel's borders. But even as its armed units were scattered, politically the PLO gained significant ground. In 1974, the Arab League recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of Palestinians, and the UN granted the PLO observer status. Arafat addressed the UN General Assembly in 1974 with his famous olive branch speech, a sign that the Palestinians had emerged as a distinct actor on the world stage, no longer simply as refugees to be absorbed or a footnote to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Throughout, Israel adamantly refused any dialogue with the PLO, which it branded a terrorist organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. The PLO covenant indeed called for replacing Israel with a secular Palestinian state. But the reality of millions of Palestinians under Israeli rule after 1967 and the persistence of the PLO's armed struggle kept the conflict very much alive. By the 1980s, a new generation of Palestinians under occupation was coming of age, and they would soon take matters into their own hands in the territories, shifting the conflict's locus inside the West Bank and Gaza. On December 9, 1987, an incident in Gaza sparked a flame that quickly spread throughout the occupied territories, a flame of popular uprising. A traffic accident. An Israeli military truck collided with a car, killing 4 Palestinian laborers, acted as a trigger for pent-up frustrations in Gaza, which had been under Israeli occupation for 20 years. Crowds of angry youths took to the streets, throwing stones at Israeli checkpoints and soldiers. The unrest spread like wildfire to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. This was the beginning of the First Intifada, Arabic for shaking off, a grassroots Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. Unlike the PLO's external armed attacks, the Intifada was largely local and spontaneous at first. It involved mass demonstrations, stone-throwing protests by teenagers, commercial strikes, graffiti, and civil disobedience. Palestinians boycotted Israeli goods, refused to pay taxes, and erected barricades in refugee camps. Women and children joined in large numbers. The imagery of young Palestinians facing off against heavily armed Israeli soldiers and tanks was broadcast worldwide, fundamentally shifting international perceptions of the conflict. The Intifada was not entirely peaceful. Molotov cocktails and the occasional firearm were used, but predominantly it was unarmed or low-level resistance by an occupied civilian population. Israel's military, unprepared for a people's revolt, responded with force. Live bullets in some cases, tear gas, mass arrests, and a controversial broken bones policy to crush protests. Over the 6 years of the First Intifada, more than 1,100 Palestinians were killed, many by live fire, and hundreds of Israelis were killed as well, including soldiers and civilians, some lynched by mobs or in terror attacks. Notably, about Israeli 160 civilians and soldiers lost their lives in the Intifada's early years, a lower toll than later conflicts, but impactful on the society. Politically, the First Intifada was a game-changer. It revitalized Palestinian nationalism on the ground. Local leadership emerged through popular committees and an underground command linked loosely to the PLO, the Unified National Leadership. Under the pressure of the uprising, the PLO in exile took significant steps. In 1988, Arafat and the PLO formally recognized the State of Israel's right to exist and accepted a two-state solution, effectively endorsing UN 242 and renouncing terrorism, at least rhetorically. That same year, the Palestinian National Council, the PLO's parliament in exile, declared an independent state of Palestine, symbolically in Algiers, referring to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem as its territory, though of course Israel controlled those areas. Many countries extended recognition to this state of Palestine on paper. On the Israeli side, the Intifada prompted a segment of the Israeli public to question the long-term viability of ruling over a hostile Palestinian population indefinitely. Peace movements like Peace Now gained momentum, and even some former Israeli generals advocated for negotiations. However, Israeli society was also polarized. Others called for tougher measures or more settlements to solidify control. Internationally, the Intifada and the end of the Cold War created new diplomatic openings. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, convened the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991, bringing Israelis, Palestinians, as part of a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, and neighboring Arab states to the table for the first time. Direct dialogue began, albeit slowly and painstakingly. The early 1990s ushered in an era of cautious hope, a belief that this decades-old conflict might be resolved through compromise. In 1993, after secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway, Israeli and PLO representatives achieved a breakthrough. Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's prime minister, a former general who had ordered tough tactics in the Intifada's early days, and Yasser Arafat, once branded a terrorist, agreed to mutual recognition. The PLO formally recognized Israel's right to exist in peace and security, and Israel recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. The result was the Oslo Accords, a declaration of principles signed in Washington, D.C. on September 13, 1993, with U.S. President Bill Clinton famously watching Rabin and Arafat shake hands on the White House lawn. Oslo 1. 1993, and a follow-up Oslo II, 1995, outlined a peace process, a 5-year interim period during which a Palestinian Authority, PA, would be established to govern parts of the West Bank and Gaza, with final status issues, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, borders, deferred to later negotiations. In essence, Israel agreed to withdraw its forces from the main Palestinian population centers. The Palestinian Authority, led by Arafat, would take over administration and security in those areas. A. Under full PA control, B. Under PA civilian control and joint security. The PLO committed to stop violence. Israel, to gradually redeploy. Gaza and the West Bank town of Jericho were the first to be handed over in 1994. The accords envisioned that by May 1999, a final peace treaty, including the creation of an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, the two-state solution, would be concluded. The Oslo Accords raised tremendous hopes among moderates on both sides and in the international community. For Israelis, it promised recognition and security, an end to being occupiers. For Palestinians, it promised an end to occupation and a path to statehood at last. The world poured billions into supporting the newborn Palestinian Authority. Arafat and the PLO leadership returned from exile to establish themselves in Gaza and Ramallah. The everyday lives of Palestinians in cities like Nablus and Gaza City briefly improved as checkpoints were removed and they governed themselves for the first time, albeit in fragmentary enclaves. Yet, Oslo's glow was short-lived. Extremists on both sides sought to derail the process. In February 1994, a Jewish extremist massacred 29 Palestinian worshippers in Hebron's Ibrahimi tomb of the patriarchs. In retaliation, Palestinian Islamist groups, notably Hamas, which had been founded in 1987 during the Intifada as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and which vehemently opposed Oslo and Israel's very existence, began suicide bombings targeting Israeli buses and cafes. These horrific attacks killed dozens of Israeli civilians, terrifying the Israeli public. Still, Rabin's government pressed on with peace steps. But in November 1995, tragedy struck peace's champions. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli right-wing extremist opposed to territorial concessions. Rabin's death was a seismic shock. His successor, Shimon Peres, lost the next election in 1996 to Benjamin Netanyahu of the hawkish Likud, who had been a fierce Oslo skeptic. Meanwhile, Palestinians grew disillusioned as well. They saw Israeli settlements doubling during the Oslo years, and many roadblocks remained. Final status: talks dragged on unresolved. Life under the PA also had its problems. Arafat's administration grew corrupt and authoritarian, and unemployment and poverty remained high. By 2000, trust was badly frayed. That summer, U.S. President Clinton convened Camp David talks between Arafat and Israel's new PM Ehud Barak to reach a final peace. They deliberated intense proposals for 2 weeks, discussing how to partition Jerusalem, how to carve a Palestinian state out of nearly all the West Bank/Gaza with possible land swaps, how to address the refugee issue. But Camp David 2000 ended with no agreement. Each side blamed the other. Israel claimed Arafat rejected a bold compromise. Palestinians said the Israeli offer denied them a viable sovereign state and East Jerusalem sovereignty. The summit's failure and mutual recriminations proved perilous. Within weeks, a spark would ignite a far more violent conflagration. In late September 2000, the conflict erupted anew, fiercer and bloodier than before. The trigger was a visit by Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon to Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, Temple Mount, on September 28, 2000, perceived as highly provocative by Palestinians. Protests by Palestinians in Jerusalem escalated into riots. Israeli police responded with live fire, killing several demonstrators. The anger quickly spread across the West Bank and Gaza. Thus began the Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Unlike the largely unarmed First Intifada, this round saw much more firearms and explosives. Clashes erupted daily at checkpoints. Palestinian gunmen ambushed Israeli soldiers and settlers. Israel deployed tanks, attack helicopters, and later fighter jets against Palestinian targets. The violence spiraled rapidly. By the end of 2000, dozens of people had been killed. By 2001, hundreds. A horrifying hallmark of the Second Intifada was the wave of Palestinian suicide bombings inside Israeli cities. Militants from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and later the PLO's own Fatah offshoot, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, dispatched young men and women with explosive belts to blow themselves up in crowded buses, nightclubs, pizzerias, any soft target. Israelis lived in fear. Almost every week brought new carnage. Over the Intifada years, approximately 1,000 Israelis, about 70% civilians, were killed. On the Palestinian side, Israel answered with overwhelming force. The IDF reoccupied cities that had been handed to the PA, like Ramallah, Nablus, and Jenin, in massive raids, notably Operation Defensive Shield in spring 2002, after a particularly deadly bombing during Passover. Urban battles raged, refugee camps were shelled, assassinations of militant leaders became routine. Israel killed Hamas's spiritual leader Sheikh Ahmed Yassin in 2004 with a helicopter strike. Israeli forces used airstrikes, armored bulldozers, and snipers in dense neighborhoods, and there were cases of heavy civilian tolls, like the fierce fighting that devastated parts of Jenin refugee camp in 2002. Overall, over 3,000 Palestinians, mostly civilians, were killed in the Second Intifada. The disparity in casualties was stark, fueling Palestinian bitterness and international criticism of Israel's tactics, even as Israelis insisted they were fighting rampant terrorism. The Second Intifada shattered what remained of the Oslo peace process. Mutual hatred and distrust reached perhaps an all-time high. The Palestinian economy and infrastructure were ravaged by closures and incursions. In a bid to stop suicide attackers, Israel began constructing a vast separation barrier, part concrete wall, part fence, snaking in and around the West Bank. A structure that cut off Palestinian villages from their farmland and cities from each other, altering the landscape and daily life profoundly. Checkpoints and roadblocks multiplied. A simple commute became an ordeal for Palestinians. On the Israeli side, every cafe or mall posted guards checking bags. Life went on under the shadow of sudden terror. Politically, moderates were marginalized. In Israel, the peace camp collapsed, and Ariel Sharon, seen once as an inflammatory figure, was elected prime minister in 2001 amid calls for security. In the Palestinian arena, Arafat was increasingly isolated and besieged, at one point literally, as Israel confined him in his Ramallah headquarters. The U.S., under President George W. Bush, initially disengaged from peace efforts, especially after the 9/11 attacks refocused U.S. priorities and cast Palestinian militancy in the same light as global terrorism. Eventually, the U.S. did propose a roadmap for peace in 2003, but it went largely unimplemented. By 2004, the Intifada was winding down, exhausted by its own destructiveness. That November, Yasser Arafat died in Paris of an illness, after decades as the embodiment of the Palestinian struggle. His passing marked the end of an era. The Palestinian Authority leadership passed to Mahmoud Abbas, who opposed the militarization of the Intifada and favored negotiations. A ceasefire was gradually restored by 2005. Both societies were profoundly scarred. Palestinians saw their hopes for statehood dashed and towns in ruins. Israelis, while militarily victorious, felt the agony of suicide bombings and feared that even offered peace deals would be met with bloodshed. The Second Intifada's legacy was deep mistrust, but it also convinced some leaders that the status quo was untenable. In a surprising turn, one of the Intifada's chief villains in Palestinian eyes, Ariel Sharon, would soon make a unilateral move that reshaped Gaza's fate. In 2005, Israel made a momentous decision with far-reaching consequences for Gaza and internal Palestinian politics. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, a hardliner who had aggressively fought the Intifada, shocked friend and foe by proposing Israel's unilateral disengagement from the Gaza Strip. In August 2005, Israel withdrew all its troops and evacuated all its settlements from Gaza, ending its 38-year direct presence there. About 21 settlements and 9,000 Israeli settlers were pulled out of Gaza, some forcibly dragged away by Israeli soldiers in dramatic scenes of tears and resistance. Along with Gaza, Sharon also dismantled 4 small settlements in the northern West Bank, though the West Bank overall remained under tight Israeli control. The world watched in astonishment as the architect of some settlement policies now removed settlers for the first time. Sharon argued that holding on to impoverished, densely populated Gaza was a strategic liability and that Israel would be better off without it. The United States supported the move, while Palestinians had mixed feelings, relief that the settlers and bases were gone, but skepticism about Israel's motives and the lack of coordination with the PA. When Israel's withdrawal was complete, September 2005, Gaza technically was no longer occupied. Israel retained control over Gaza's airspace, coastal waters, and border crossings, except Rafah, which was given temporarily to PA control under an agreement. The Palestinian Authority assumed governance of Gaza, but little was done to rebuild its economy before a political earthquake hit. Hamas, which had gained popularity through its intifada attacks and grassroots charity networks, decided to participate in politics. In January 2006, the first Palestinian legislative elections in a decade were held, under international pressure for reform and democracy. To general surprise, Hamas won a majority, defeating the long-dominant Fatah Party, Arafat's party, now led by Abbas. This election revealed Palestinians' frustration with Fatah's corruption and the failures of Oslo, and an endorsement, at least by some, of Hamas's defiance of Israel. However, the Hamas victory triggered immediate external and internal crises. Israel, the US, and EU labeled Hamas a terrorist organization and refused to deal with any PA government it led. Western aid to the PA was frozen, and Israel withheld tax revenues, aiming to undermine the new Hamas government. Tensions flared between Hamas and Fatah, which had very different visions and constituencies. Sporadic armed clashes erupted in Gaza between their loyalists through 2006. Efforts to form a unity government failed amid mutual distrust. In June 2007, this power struggle climaxed in factional warfare in Gaza. After a week of bloody street battles, Hamas forces routed Fatah's security apparatus in Gaza and took full control of the Gaza Strip by force. Fatah officials fled or were violently suppressed, some thrown from rooftops in infamous incidents. The Palestinian polity was now split in two. Hamas ruled Gaza, while Fatah, under President Mahmoud Abbas, governed the PA in the West Bank. This Fatah-Hamas split remains a fundamental schism to this day. The aftermath for Gaza was dire. Israel and Egypt, wary of Hamas, imposed a strict blockade on Gaza, controlling its borders, coast, and airspace. Essentially, Gaza became a 365-square-kilometer enclave sealed off from the world, its economy strangled, its residents, about 2 million by now, largely unable to leave, reliant on smuggling tunnels and limited aid. Hamas consolidated its rule, bolstered by an armed wing, the Qassam Brigades, and popular support from those who saw its resistance as honorable. Abbas's PA in the West Bank, conversely, engaged in security cooperation with Israel to clamp down on Hamas there and continued negotiations, in fits and starts, toward a peace agreement that never materialized. This internal division weakened the Palestinian national movement, two rival governments claiming legitimacy, no unified strategy. Ordinary Palestinians felt the pain, especially Gazans, who endured increasing poverty and isolation, and West Bankers, who saw their dream of unity and statehood dim further. Meanwhile, Hamas's ascendance in Gaza set the stage for repeated cycles of violent conflict with Israel in the years ahead. In the aftermath of the split, the tiny Gaza Strip, so densely populated and fraught with militancy, became the flashpoint for repeated wars. With Hamas in control, rocket fire from Gaza into southern Israel, which had sporadically occurred since the early 2000s, intensified. Hamas and smaller factions, like Islamic Jihad, acquired rudimentary Qassam rockets and later Iranian-designed missiles capable of reaching major Israeli cities. Israel, asserting its right to self-defense, struck back hard each time. Over the past 15 years, Gaza and Israel have engaged in several devastating rounds of conflict. 2008 to 2009, Operation Cast Lead. After escalating rocket attacks and reciprocal strikes, Israel launched a massive 21-day military offensive into Gaza in December 2008. The Israeli Air Force pounded targets from the air, and ground troops pushed deep into Gaza's urban areas. Hamas fought back with guerrilla tactics, but was outmatched. The war killed some 1,400 Palestinians, including hundreds of civilians, and 13 Israelis, 3 civilians, according to human rights groups. Scenes of destruction, flattened neighborhoods, wrecked schools, including a UN school hit in error, drew international outrage. Israel said Hamas embedded fighters in civilian areas. Palestinians recounted horrific incidents of civilian deaths. A ceasefire was unilaterally declared in January 2009. Hamas emerged militarily weakened but still in power, and it claimed resistance victory by surviving. November 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. Another flare-up occurred after Hamas fired rockets at Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for the first time, and Israel assassinated a top Hamas commander. This 8-day conflict saw intense Israeli airstrikes and hundreds of rockets launched from Gaza. Over 160 Palestinians and 6 Israelis were killed. Notably, during this round, Israel did not launch a ground invasion, and an Egyptian-mediated truce took hold relatively quickly. July-August 2014, Operation Protective Edge. This was the deadliest war since 1967 for Palestinians in Gaza. After the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teens by a Hamas-linked cell and the revenge killing of a Palestinian teen, tensions ignited. Massive Israeli airstrikes began, followed by a ground incursion aimed at destroying Hamas's extensive tunnel networks that infiltrated into Israel. The fighting raged 50 days. Hamas fired thousands of rockets, mostly intercepted by Israel's new Iron Dome defense system or landing in open areas, and even managed commando raids via tunnels. Israel hammered Gaza from land, air, and sea. The toll: over 2,200 Palestinians killed. The UN said about 70% were civilians, and 73 Israelis killed, 67 soldiers, 6 civilians. Entire districts in eastern Gaza City and Rafah were turned to rubble. Images of children pulled from collapsed buildings filled TV screens. Civilians in southern Israel lived in bomb shelters for weeks. International efforts, including a U.S. and Egypt-brokered ceasefire, eventually ended the carnage. The 2014 war left Gaza in ruins, and a UN report later suggested both sides may have committed war crimes. May 2021, the 11-day war. Tensions in East Jerusalem, fueled by attempts to evict Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan, finally boiled over. Hamas, presenting itself as defender of Jerusalem, fired a salvo of rockets toward Jerusalem on May 10, 2021. Israel responded with heavy airstrikes. For 11 days, Gaza was pummeled from the air while Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched over 4,000 rockets at Israeli cities, overwhelming Iron Dome at times. International concern mounted as an airstrike destroyed a tower housing media offices like Associated Press, Al Jazeera, and as Gaza casualties climbed. Around 260 Palestinians and 13 people in Israel were killed in that short span. A ceasefire mediated by Egypt took hold. This round showed Hamas's improved capabilities, longer-range rockets, drone attempts, and Israel's still lethal force, but importantly, the war triggered intercommunal unrest inside Israel itself. Mixed cities saw Jewish-Arab riots, underscoring the conflict's deep roots. 2023, the Gaza War. This was the most ferocious and transformative escalation in decades. On October 7, 2023, in a meticulously planned surprise attack, Hamas fighters breached the Gaza-Israel frontier by land, sea, and even motorized paraglider in a multi-pronged assault on adjacent Israeli communities. They overran military bases and kibbutzim, carrying out horrific massacres of civilians. More than 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, were killed in that single day, the deadliest day in Israel's history. Hamas gunmen also abducted around 240 hostages, men, women, children, elderly, dragging them into Gaza's labyrinth. The attack, shocking in scale and brutality, stunned Israel and the world. Israel declared war for the first time since 1973. What followed was an unprecedented Israeli onslaught on Gaza. The IDF subjected Gaza to continuous intensive bombardment, targeting Hamas infrastructure but also leveling entire neighborhoods. Ground forces entered Gaza later in October, engaging in fierce urban combat with Hamas militants. Casualty figures on the Palestinian side skyrocketed. By early June 2025, according to Gazan health officials, more than 54,000 Gazans had been killed in this war, a staggering toll, roughly 2% of Gaza's population. Massive devastation was wrought. An estimated two-thirds of all buildings in Gaza were damaged or destroyed, turning much of the territory into an apocalyptic landscape of rubble. Israel, too, paid a price. About 1,700 Israelis were killed in total, including the massacre victims and soldiers in subsequent fighting. A brief pause occurred in early 2025 with a ceasefire and hostage exchanges, mediated by regional and international players. But talks for a longer truce faltered and fighting resumed. The 2023 war marked a grim new chapter. Never had the conflict seen such high casualties in such a short time. The scale of destruction in Gaza and the unprecedented breach of Israel's defenses on October 7, 2023, shook the region's politics to the core. In Israel, anger and grief over the atrocities fueled calls to eliminate Hamas entirely. In Gaza and the broader Arab world, outrage at the humanitarian catastrophe sparked protests and difficult questions for Arab governments that had normalized ties with Israel. As of mid-2025, Gaza remained in a humanitarian crisis and sporadic conflict continued, making the prospects of a negotiated peace even more remote. Each of these Gaza wars followed a tragic pattern: rocket attacks, Israeli retaliation, civilians caught in between, ceasefires, but no permanent resolution. The blockade of Gaza persisted, meaning even in quiet times, its people lived in what has been described as an open-air prison, with severe shortages of clean water, electricity, and freedom of movement. For Israelis, especially those in towns near Gaza like Sderot, life meant periodic dashes to bomb shelters with only seconds warning of incoming rockets, and a gnawing fear for families living under constant threat. The human cost on both sides further cemented mutual hatred. Yet, even in the darkest of times, there were flashes of humanity. Israeli doctors treating Palestinian patients, Gazan civilians reaching out online to show grief for Israeli losses, etc. But overwhelmingly, repeated Gaza wars deepened the abyss of distrust. While Gaza captured headlines with wars, in the larger West Bank the conflict has persisted in a grinding, daily manner, quieter but deeply entrenched. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, remains under Israeli occupation since 1967, now spanning well over half a century. Over the years, Israel established a network of settlements, Israeli civilian communities built on lands beyond the 1949 Green Line. As of 2023, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These settlements range from small hilltop outposts to sizable towns. They are connected by Israeli-only bypass roads and protected by the Israeli army. Settlements are considered illegal under international law, Fourth Geneva Convention, by the UN and most countries, but Israel disputes this. Successive Israeli governments have supported and subsidized the settlement enterprise, seeing it either as fulfillment of historic/biblical claims or as enhancing security depth. Many settlers also move there for affordable housing, with government incentives. For Palestinians, the settlement expansion has been a relentless encroachment on the land they envision for a future state. By 2020s, approximately 40% of the West Bank is directly controlled by settlements, military zones, or settler roads. Palestinian towns and villages have become isolated enclaves separated by checkpoints, roadblocks, and the sprawling separation barrier that Israel built during the Second Intifada. Daily life for Palestinians in the West Bank is circumscribed by a matrix of Israeli control. To travel from one city to another often requires passing through Israeli checkpoints where queues and inspections are routine. Movement is not freedom of movement, but rather movement by permission. The city of Hebron epitomizes the occupation's microcosm. A few hundred ideological Israeli settlers live in fortified compounds in the heart of this Palestinian city of 200,000, guarded by thousands of soldiers. Entire Palestinian markets and streets in Hebron's old city have been shut down to secure the settlers. Palestinian residents navigate a maze of barricades and checkpoints daily just to reach their homes. Tensions are constant and violence sporadic, settler attacks on Palestinians, and vice versa. The Israeli human rights group Selam has documented hundreds of physical obstacles Israel deploys. As of early 2023, there were about 565 roadblocks and checkpoints inside the West Bank controlling Palestinian movement. Every aspect of West Bank life is affected. East Jerusalem, which Palestinians hope to have as their capital, has been effectively annexed by Israel, and its Palestinian residents live under Israeli law as permanent residents, but often face home demolitions if they build illegally, since getting permits from Israeli authorities is extremely difficult. In the rest of the West Bank, Israeli military law prevails. The Palestinian Authority administers city centers, Area A, but Israel frequently conducts night raids to arrest suspected militants, without needing PA consent. The younger Palestinian generation in these areas has grown up knowing only occupation, many having experienced the inside of an Israeli prison or having family who have. One sees the occupation in the looming presence of the concrete wall near Bethlehem or Qalqilia, cutting Palestinians off from their fields. One feels it in the long lines of workers at 4 a.m. at Qalandia checkpoint, waiting to cross into Israel for day labor. One hears it in the stories of farmers who need permits to access their own olive groves trapped behind the separation fence. And one fears it in the sight of soldiers patrolling streets, or the sound of gunfire when clashes erupt between stone-throwing youths and the army. Despite these hardships, about 3 million Palestinians continue to live in the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem, under occupation alongside the settler population. Many Palestinians practice sumud, or steadfastness, continuing normal life, studying, farming, raising families, in the face of systemic pressures to emigrate or give up. The international community frequently criticizes settlement expansion and human rights violations in the occupied territories. The United Nations regularly passes resolutions affirming the illegality of settlements and calling for an end to the occupation. Yet, without a political solution, the status quo grinds on. For Israelis, the West Bank's biblical names, Judea and Samaria, resonate, and security arguments hold sway. They fear a hostile entity on the hills overlooking Tel Aviv's coastal plain. For Palestinians, the West Bank is the heartland of their history and culture. Nablus, Jenin, Jericho, now dismembered by what they see as colonial takeovers. The checkpoints and walls not only restrict movement, but also, as critics say, restrict the horizon, making hope scarce. Throughout the twists and turns of this conflict's history, the international community has been deeply involved, sometimes as peacemakers, sometimes as partisan backers, and often as witnesses to the tragedy. From the early days, the United Nations played a key role. It proposed the 1947 Partition Plan. It set up relief agencies like UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which to this day supports millions of Palestinian refugees, and it passed numerous resolutions framing the conflict's terms. UNSC Resolution 242 after 1967, for instance, became the basis for Land for Peace. The UN also, in 1974, invited Yasser Arafat to speak and granted the PLO observer status, implicitly recognizing Palestinian national rights. In 2012, the UN General Assembly went further, voting to upgrade Palestine to a non-member observer state, effectively recognizing a state of Palestine on the 1967 lines, despite U.S. and Israeli objections. Yet, UN resolutions remain unfulfilled. They are moral and legal reference points, but are not enforceable without consensus of great powers. The United States has arguably been the most influential external actor. A close ally of Israel since the 1960s, the U.S. provides Israel with extensive military aid and diplomatic backing. Washington repeatedly used its veto power to shield Israel from condemnatory UN Security Council resolutions. American mediation was pivotal at many junctures. President Carter brokered the Egypt-Israel Camp David Accords in 1978. President Clinton hosted the Oslo signing in 1993 and Camp David 2000. President Bush launched the 2003 roadmap. President Obama tried shuttle diplomacy, like the 2013 to 2014 carry talks. However, U.S. policy has often been criticized as biased toward Israel. Indeed, Palestinians often view America as Israel's lawyer rather than an honest broker. Nonetheless, no lasting peace seems achievable without U.S. involvement, given its leverage. In recent years, the U.S. under President Trump took unprecedented pro-Israel steps, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. embassy there in 2018 to Palestinian fury as East Jerusalem's status was supposed to be negotiated, and cutting most aid to Palestinian institutions. Yet, the U.S. also midwifed the Abraham Accords in 2020, a different paradigm of peacemaking between Israel and Arab states that bypassed the Palestinians. The Arab states have been key players from the outset, from fighting in 1948 and 1967 to later negotiating peace. After Egypt's separate peace in 1979, the Arab League eventually, in 2002, put forward the Arab Peace Initiative, offering Israel full normalization with all Arab countries in exchange for a withdrawal to 1967 lines and a just solution for Palestinian refugees. Israel never formally accepted that offer. Over the decades, Arab states like Jordan also made peace. Jordan-Israel Treaty in 1994 established full relations and settled border issues. Jordan, which had controlled the West Bank, relinquished all claims to it in 1988 in favor of the PLO, and today Jordan remains a crucial intermediary and custodian of Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. The Gulf Arab states historically boycotted Israel, but shifting geopolitics, particularly a shared interest with Israel in countering Iran, led to the groundbreaking Abraham Accords. In 2020, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel, followed by Morocco and Sudan. These agreements were signed at the White House and hailed as a new era of peace, but conspicuously left out the Palestinians, offering them only lip service. While these Arab countries gained benefits, U.S. arms, economic deals, recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara, etc., the Palestinian leadership felt betrayed, seeing fellow Arabs making separate peace while the occupation continued. Other Muslim-majority nations like Turkey and Iran have had their roles. Turkey once had good ties with Israel, then relations soured over Gaza, particularly after the 2010 flotilla incident where Israeli forces killed Turkish activists. Iran, since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, became Israel's fiercest enemy, heavily supporting militant groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Palestine with funds and weapons. The Iran-Israel shadow conflict often influences Gaza flare-ups and is a subtext of Israel's urgency in forming alliances with Gulf states who also fear Iran. The European Union and individual European states are significant donors to the Palestinian Authority and advocates of a two-state solution. The EU frequently condemns settlements and home demolitions. Yet Europe's ability to shape events is limited compared to the US, and Israel sometimes bristles at European criticism as interference. Finally, the wider international civil society and movements have become involved, from human rights NGOs documenting abuses to the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, launched by Palestinian activists in 2005 urging nonviolent economic pressure on Israel to end the occupation. This campaign gained traction in some academic and cultural circles worldwide, but also sparked intense backlash and accusations that it seeks to delegitimize Israel. In summary, the conflict long ago transcended its local roots to become a global issue, a symbolic battleground involving questions of colonialism, justice, security, and human rights. Efforts at mediation have repeatedly come agonizingly close to peace, or at least to interim breakthroughs, only to falter due to lack of trust, political assassinations, changes in leadership, or extremist spoilers. The two-state solution, Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace, has been the declared goal of the international consensus for nearly 3 decades. Yet as of 2025, it seems more distant than ever. The physical viability of a Palestinian state has been eroded by settlements and fragmentation, and political will on both sides has waned. Some now speak of a coming future of one state, whether that be a binational democracy or, as Palestinians fear, an apartheid-like reality of one state that permanently subjugates them. Others call for renewed commitment to two states with robust international guarantees. As our documentary journey nears its end, the story of the Israel-Palestine conflict remains tragically unfinished. We have traveled from antiquity to the present, from ancient kingdoms and Roman legions, through the rise of Zionism and Arab nationalism amid collapsing empires, through partitions and wars, 1948's independence and Nakba, 1967's occupation, intifadas, and elusive peace deals. We have seen how both peoples, Jews and Palestinian Arabs, are deeply attached to this same land and how historical traumas have shaped their identities. For Jewish Israelis, the Holocaust and millennia of persecution forged a determination to have a secure homeland at almost any cost. For Palestinians, the Nakba and decades of displacement and occupation have entrenched a resolve to resist dispossession and achieve freedom and statehood. Today, the conflict endures in daily scenes: an Israeli soldier at a checkpoint checking IDs, a Palestinian child in Gaza studying by candlelight because electricity is scarce, an Orthodox Jewish family building a home in a West Bank settlement overlooking a Palestinian village, a mother on each side grieving a son lost to violence. Episodes of hope, the Oslo handshake, the Gaza disengagement, have often given way to new cycles of bloodshed. And yet, voices of peace persist. Israeli and Palestinian bereaved families joining together to demand reconciliation, activists protesting evictions in Sheikh Jarrah or against terrorist attacks, young people on both sides who say, "Enough." The international community, for all its efforts, has not imposed a solution. Ultimately, Israelis and Palestinians themselves must decide how to live together or apart in this narrow land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Will it be two states, Israel and Palestine, sharing Jerusalem and living in peace? That vision, though backed by the UN and many world powers, seems ever harder to realize on the ground. Or will there be continued conflict and perhaps some other political arrangement forced by realities? As of now, Israel remains in control from the river to the sea, except for the tight enclave of Hamas-run Gaza, a status quo punctuated by outbreaks of war. The West Bank occupation and settlement enterprise grind on, while Palestinians, divided between Fatah and Hamas, struggle to present a united front. Meanwhile, changing regional dynamics, like Arab states normalizing with Israel through the Abraham Accords, have altered the conflict's landscape but not resolved its core. The year 2023's horrific violence underscored how dangerous and combustible the situation remains, not just for Israelis and Palestinians, but for the whole region and beyond. And yet, the story is not over. This documentary has spanned thousands of years of history leading to a conflict that, at heart, is about two people seeking dignity, security, and recognition. As viewers, perhaps unfamiliar before with the conflict's long arc, you may now better understand the depth of each side's aspirations and grievances. We have sought to present these events and perspectives neutrally, not to assign blame, but to illuminate why this conflict is so emotional and enduring. In doing so, we hope to humanize those who are often reduced to statistics or stereotypes on the news. In a world troubled by division, the Israel-Palestine conflict stands as a poignant example of how history, when unresolved, can bind people in a tragic embrace. But history is also full of surprises. A century ago, few could imagine an Israeli state or a Palestinian national consciousness as they exist today. Perhaps a century from now, people will look back at our era with astonishment that peace took so long to achieve. As the cameras fade, we end not with answers, but with questions. Can the land of the Holy Land be shared justly? Can the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, of Sarah and Hagar, the metaphorical brothers, find a path to coexistence? The narrative continues to unfold, written by the choices of leaders and ordinary citizens. The Israel-Palestine conflict's history is indeed long and painful, but it also reminds us that even the deepest wounds can, with courage and empathy, inch toward healing. The final chapters are yet to be written. Let us hope they will be chapters of peace and reconciliation, so that future generations of Israelis and Palestinians may narrate a very different story, one not of conflict, but of mutual understanding and lasting peace. Thank you for watching. and for staying with us through such a dense and emotional topic. We know 90 minutes are not enough to cover every nuance, every life, every event that deserves attention. We apologize for what we could not include. If you found this documentary insightful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your support helps us continue creating thoughtful, balanced explorations of complex global issues. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and may peace prevail.